Right. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy to have you here. I'm Brent Never. I'm director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership, and just so happy to have you here. I don't know about you all, but we lost power here at the office, so we're scrambling a little bit, trying to get everything fired back up, and you know how it goes. Um, but with that said, we're excited to have Dave Renz here, an old friend. Not old, sorry, Dave. A young
No, it's
friend
old. It's old.
um, at the Midwest Center, and a former director for a long time. And I'm sure he's worked with many of you, and an expert, a national expert on governance and boards. So today we're going to be talking about crucial and critical conversations in these difficult times. So while we're getting fired up and people are still coming, I did want to highlight some upcoming events here at the Midwest Center. So um, one that we're excited about is on May 15th, we're going to be doing a scenario planning workshop. Scenario planning is a topic we covered a couple months ago, and we had the title of our session being uh, Strategic Plans Are Dead, Long Live Scenario Planning. And, in this time of a lot of change happening all at once, it's hard to think of, how a plan is going to be executed in the next 3 to 5 years. And the idea is to come up with a series of actionable scenarios of what you're going to do in the next short to medium term. And it's a workshop. So you come in and we provide some materials, we work through it, but also we sit there with you. Our hope is to have up to three people from an organization come. So I invite, people such as executive directors, maybe a CFO, maybe a chief development officer. Those types of folks are very welcome. And so we're excited about the workshop. Also, we have our rolling series, fundraising tools series. On April 25th, we're going to be doing a really good one about transforming volunteers into fearless fundraisers. May 2nd, measurement and evaluation fundraising. May 9th, demystifying capital campaigns. And May 16th, crafting a dynamic annual development plan. And then lastly, but surely not least, next month, our nonprofit navigation is about transforming mission delivery, harnessing AI for nonprofit excellence. So these are all on our website, and I know Cindy will pop that link into the chat so that you guys can see it. With that said, though, today we're going to have our uh, crucial and critical conversations on board governance. And just so you know where this came from, it really came through a critical conversation that Dave and I had about what's going on in the world as far as the federal environment, and clearly that's pushing down to the state and local environment also. It can feel pretty isolating at some points to be in the leadership role in these times. And surely your board is your biggest ally in the organization. We wanted to tee up some of those conversations that we think you should have, and also talk about how you might organize that conversation because we all have some untidiness in our lives, and an untidy board meeting is probably not what you want. So we'll also talk about methods of organizing. So with that, this is going to be a conversation. I have some questions for Dave, but also you all please pop questions into the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And we also surveyed people who had registered earlier for their questions. So we're going to tee up those questions. Um, but first, Dave, I'm really happy to have you here. And let's just start sort of basic about governance. When we say governance, what do we mean? And what does it mean to be practicing good governance?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question since that's what we're all about. Excuse me. It is allergy season, by the way. Excuse me. I was doing fine until I had to talk. Um, One of the things that I bug a lot of our colleagues about because they use the word governance to simply refer to whatever it is that the board is doing or should be doing. And there's a hint of truth to that, which is part of why it makes it even more messed up at times. Governance is really the process of providing strategic leadership to the organization. And one of the reasons I don't like equating it to boards is because for a good share of nonprofits, it's the executive director or CEO. I'm going to use those words interchangeably here. They are integral to the governance process as well, because the process is about setting the direction, making policy, overseeing performance, making sure that the organization is accountable. Um, Fundraising is not governance. Sorry, folks, if I'm disappointing you or scaring you. By the way, I don't think that makes it any less important for a board to play a significant role in fundraising. It's just it's not governance. There are other things boards do, just like there are other things that executive directors do. And so governance is really important. And unfortunately, a lot of boards, and this is probably part of what's behind my thoughts as we were talking about this, Brent. Um, a lot of boards think that it's just governance, and good governance is all about just holding the staff accountable or keeping their feet to the fire, whatever metaphor you want to use for that. And that is only slightly accurate, moderately accurate. Boards exist, and the governance process to be effective in governance is all about working together to achieve the outcomes and the mission of the organization. And so fiduciary, that classic legal stuff that people talk about, that's part of the work of the board. That is an element, but it's like the really basic element of our foundation of good governance. Our colleagues at Harvard, actually about 30 years ago, I'm shocked to say now, uh, actually developed a nice framework, if you will, about governance. And they talked about three kinds of governance. There's fiduciary governance, they called it type one. And I don't know where they're hanging out, but they said everybody does that pretty well. It's the other ones that are more of a challenge. And I'm thinking to myself, fiduciary doesn't always fly well in the worlds I'm watching. But the second type of governance is strategic governance. And it's kind of like strategic planning, Brent. It's the concepts that you hopefully partly tongue in cheek, we're saying are now dead after your last navigation session. But by the way, connecting to the more important critical conversations and your what's really going on besides strategic planning is what they call generative governance. And generative governance is the concept of figuring out where and how we fit in the world, we, the organization, and we as leaders of the organization, where and how do we fit in that world? And frankly, a whole lot of boards aren't aware that they should ever be talking about that, even though sometimes they might have a conversation, often as an accident or at least a side of the strategic planning process. But the critical issue of generative governance is as the world is evolving and changing, spoiler alert, folks, we think the world is changing here at the Midwest Center. That's our thought. When that world is changing, you have to rethink what parts of your prior conception of where and how you fit in the world still make sense. By the way, that usually would be the mission and core values. But then, if if your strategies are no longer in sync with what's going to challenge you in the coming cycle of work in the world for the organization I'm talking about, then you need to think even more deeply. And the part of why some groups shy away from generative governance is because it's harder and there's no right answer, although there are better and worse answers. And that's where board executive conversations, just dialogues need to occur and why they're so powerful. So sorry to rattle on about that, but I've thought about it and I can't keep from saying what I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful, Dave, to sort of set the table on what governance is. It's a relationship. It's not a structure. You know, boards are structures and boards are really important. But it's that relationship. I know that you and Bob Herman, a former colleague, and Dick Heimovic all studied this work. And really, to put it in a nutshell, those organizations, Bob found, those organizations that had really productive governance relationships tended to do better. And so Dave, we were talking the other day at the wonderful United Way symposium down at the conference center that they put on, and thank you to the United Way for doing that. Um, we were talking about sort of this instinct right now to duck and cover. There's an instinct that I have, the Midwest Center often is run a lot like a nonprofit. We're 100% soft funded. So just like you guys, we also are in the mix. And I feel that feeling of, boy, just, I need to get in that fetal crouch and just not let people know how, tumultuous the times are right now. So Dave, in the spirit of getting out of duck and cover, in the spirit of having good conversations with your board, how do you even start to think about what those conversations should, what they are? We just talked about generative conversations, fiduciary conversations. But some of us might be thinking, God, I've had conversations with my board before, and they were pretty crappy conversations. I'd love to have a better conversation. How do you start to think about setting that up?
I think you yell at them and tell them to shape up. Well, okay, so that's just your first gut. If I'm not going to duck and cover, I want to chew them out. Um, and by the way, the I really am sympathetic to everybody, by the way, for the stress in that context, Brent, because the and this is my excuse for not offering a quick pat answer. Um, if you want the really fast answer, maybe it's fat too, fast answer, it's 3 words: communicate, communicate, communicate. Now, that sounds great. That's easy, right? Well, no, it's not at all easy. And you said a minute ago, it's about relationships. So, uh, what I'm about to say all needs to be tempered by your understanding, your assessment of where that relationship within the board, among board members, because by the way, a whole lot of the time, board members aren't talking to each other. Sometimes we've got strong executive committees that are kind of running out on their own, especially when they feel like there's an emergency. Other times, folks are just not connected all that well. But then, the board executive relationship, you have to start where you are. And unfortunately, if you don't have a real strong relationship with your board, or your board doesn't have a strong understanding of where and how they could be stepping in, then you're going to have to back up in a sense. I mean, I wouldn't call it backing up so much as I'd just say you need to be building from a fairly basic level. You've got to meet folks where they are. And I will say honestly that, duck and cover applies to board members, only they have an easier time sometimes of dropping away from the interactions, because their version of duck and cover is to withdraw when they hear that things are going so poorly or things might be going so poorly that, we may have only half as much money. By the way, before this year, I've used that as a metaphor, but it's almost never been true. This year, there are nonprofits this week that are waking up in the morning and reading news that they will have 30 to 70% less revenue than they had under contract. I mean, stunning times. But the the key about meeting them where they are, I believe, is, and this requires you ideally to be able to consult with your chair and the two of you, executive director and chair, interacting. I'm assuming many people on here are executive directors, which is why I said you, but the chair and executive should talk about how do we move forward with this conversation. Ideally, the chair has a reasonable sense of where folks kind of are in terms of their readiness to even talk about this. Because if you come tearing in to a meeting or hold an emergency meeting or even just your next regular board meeting and say, the sky is falling, if they don't even know really how the nonprofit operates, for example, as a financial animal, or how it operates in connection with other actors in the community, they're going to duck and cover because it's kind of like, I don't know what to do with this. This is killer news. I haven't been prepared. And I will tell you honestly, and I don't mean this rudely at all, but there are a lot of executives who have enjoyed, at least for many times, the lack of engagement of boards because it's kind of like, I'm I'm in charge of this stuff and I'm keeping it going, so that's great. But we need boards. And by the way, one of my colleagues, actually one of the guys who wrote that book, Governance is Leadership, a guy named Bill Ryan, actually described one of the roles of boards as that of the fire department. They should be ready and on hand. And when you need them, you can call upon them and they can come help you put out a fire. They may have tools and resources that you don't to help at least manage the damage, if not actually put out the fire. But if the board doesn't even know where they're going, if they don't know what their role is in the organization, then they don't even know how to process where we should be going from here. And so the duck and cover response is understandable because one of the elements of that then is, oh wow, we're just going to hide. Well, we need to, and let me just underscore something everybody knows, but I just want to go back to it. Fundamentally, this is about sustaining and enhancing, if we can, the performance of our mission, even during the toughest of times. I mean, let's face it, these times with some of the challenges we're living right now actually are what a lot of our organizations were made for, although not maybe in quite the extreme state that we're in. It depends entirely on your mission category right now. I just saw this morning's Beacon and it was highlighting what's happening in Head Start agencies, and we're going to see federal dynamics in Head Start play out in all sorts of ugly ways. It's just working right down the list. By the way, if you're not familiar, quick, and this is related to the conversation, but it's about you getting a little bit more prepared to even think about what these conversations should be. The National Council of Nonprofits has some excellent resources. They're not exactly cheery all the time because one of them is a resource that says, what's the status of every executive order that's come out of the president's office since since January, and where is it right now in terms of status of implementation, or is there a court case holding it or freezing it or whatever else? So, pulling that kind of information in is important. But to go back, Brent, to the basic question, I think what we need to be doing is figuring out how can we realistically, but not frighteningly, invite the board to come with us to connect, to have discussions. And maybe some of those at first are one-on-one. It depends on what your relationship is with your board right now. If you're working quite well as a team, and that is my aspiration, but it's an aspiration. A lot of places, your board isn't a team for whatever reason. And ideally, the executive director and board are together part of that team. Figure out with your chair, how can we start raising awareness? Now, if they don't know anything about the organization, then of course you've got a lot more to sort of prepare them for. But this is where sometimes one of the first layers of the conversation can be to just begin to raise awareness and start the dialogue with your board by talking about where we are and having a discussion that's not just you as the expert telling them all the awful stuff or that could be happening or is happening, but talking about how does our organization get affected in key layers of sort of intensity in this operating environment with the things that seem to be percolating. And so it's just, like helping them know a lot of boards don't know what their revenue model is. So they actually don't know when they hear the president is freezing grants, or other appropriations money, things like that. They don't actually know, well, like, does that mean 20% of our money is frozen? Or maybe good news, we don't get federal money, so we don't have to worry about it at all. But by the way, there's layers, as you no doubt recognize, to that. There are folks who aren't getting money from the federal government, but they're getting federal money. It's just coming through intermediaries in the chain along the way. So there may be some remedial, I wouldn't call it that, but there may be some remedial sort of building from the ground up, what makes these things relevant questions or topics for us to talk about. And we're going to need to talk about these things and then kind of cue it up from that. If you want, we can talk, about some of the elements of like a retreat or something like that. These are times that call for that level of intensity, and it may scare off a few board members. And we have to be empathetic. People didn't sign up thinking these were the kind of times we were going to be living in. But the reality is we have to try to be supportive, help people, not tell them that we're dead in the water, but we've got things to figure out. That's why, strategies and the strategic plan we have are not guaranteed. They may or may not be relevant. So we got to go back and kind of talk about that. Mm-hmm. And being empathetic, I know this makes people tired, but to the extent you can do one-on-one or maybe Zoom meetings with a couple of folks at a time and just begin to make them aware of the evolving conditions. And I mean, for better and worse, by the way, that even if you don't have a great relationship with your board, this may be the crisis that unfreezes things without anybody being as blunt as saying, you guys have been asleep at the wheel, but it's time to come join us. You know, this is a critical time for everybody. And so the sort of silver lining to this cloud is maybe everybody can relate to the fact that, oh yeah, if there was ever a time for us to think more about being engaged more actively, that's now. Now, Brent, you made mention of the work that Bob Herman and Dick Heimovitz did. I don't get any credit for that, although it is actually the reason I came to UMKC. I read their book. They call their concept board-centered executive leadership. And it's about the role of executives in enabling effective board service, effective board performance. And they wrote the book in 1991, but some of us are older than dirt. So, that was just middle of my career. And I read the book, and then UMKC said they were looking for a nonprofit professor. And so I actually connected with UMKC because of that. It's still, I have people who today in the national capacity building world, nonprofit capacity building world, tell me, I wish Bob and Dick were around. They need to rewrite that book, not because it needs to change, but because it just needs to be brought up to date, because it's so relevant. Now, by the way, it's a book, so I can't do more than give you a couple of headlines out of this thing. But the essence of it is effective executive directors, and they did their research in town here. So it was really building on, the book is called Board-Centered Executive Leadership. And we can put a link up to that. The essence of their findings were effective executives don't say, I'm here doing executive work, you're there doing the board work, so do your job, folks, and I'll do my job, and it'll all be great. The reality is executive directors have what Bob and Dick called psychological centrality. They are at the center, even though legally the board is the entity that has the authority and accountability at the state level. I mean, it's a matter of law. So effective executives help their boards organize their work, provide education and training, not dominating the board, but providing their side of shared leadership and creating interactive and engaged dynamics. And one of the things that Bob and Dick talked about, excuse me a second, rain and allergies. They said effective executives help boards, they work together to envision change and innovation for the organization, but they do it together. And that's the generative conversation. And frankly, whether it's retreats where you can get everybody in the room are the ideal way to do that. Now, Sometimes that's not feasible. In the Zoom era, there are multiple ways, as we see this morning, to get folks sort of in a room together. And so we have to think about that. But effective executives create structures. Now, that sounds like a fancy construct, but the reality is having a productive meeting is the meeting is a structure, and using that time well is organizing a structure, working with your chair, setting this stuff up, and using the time well. And so, maybe sending them a 1 or 2 page summary of emerging issues that are going to affect us prior to having some discussions would be a way to begin that conversation. And then the evolution needs to progress into having more engaged full group interaction, trying to really build the capacity of your group as a team. But I'm kind of rattling on here, Brent. Sorry.
Oh, no, I mean, this is really good. I just want to tease out a couple points and sort of highlight them. One is, if you think about roles, we have these traditional roles, and you, Dave, have talked about this. The executive director is the psychological center of the organization, sort of sets the plate. But also you think about your board chair, maybe the chair of a finance committee. The way I think about it is you think of your board as I'm thinking of the cartoons, the Hall of Justice, right? So you had all the superpowers and all the superheroes. And sometimes, it can get tiresome when your attorney on the board starts talking about, the law, or your insurance person starts talking about liability. But I'll tell you what, this is the time that you're really happy that you have the attorney on the board, and you have the person familiar with insurance or HR, or whatever it might be. I'm wondering, Dave, is there, traditionally there was a sense that boards stay at the high level. They aren't working in operations. They really need to let the executive execute and stay out of our business. At the same time, it seems like right now this is a good time to spitball with some of your trusted members of your board. And this may not be a full board meeting, but like you said, some key members. What do you think about that? Really sort of pinging off of them for their understanding of even operations, but tactics.
Well, I think that's really a key point, Brent. And ideally, you've been able to do that before, although maybe nothing has been quite as dramatic as emerging circumstances now for that reason. There are people on boards who have the unique expertise you're referring to, and it's part of the work of the board is to be a sounding board for an advisor to the executive director. And that's, the decision making is the end of the governance cycle where that happens. But the very beginning is even just like being there for each other. And by the way, I don't know, a couple of years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, we polled both executives and boards and said, hey, what do you need? I mean, one week we were talking about boards, so we polled them. Board chairs said, I said to them, what do you need? What are key ways for the executive to support you? And then the next week we did one where it focused on chief executives. We asked them, what do you need from your board? You know what the number one item on both groups' list was? It was be proactive and reach out. Please reach out. And by the way, the next number two from from board support for executives was please be there when we need you, when we need to draw on you. And your point, Brent, reminds me that in the early days of the pandemic, when the emergency relief out of the federal government was coming, remember the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program, and some of that stuff? You could get that loan, and if you actually used it for the right intended purposes, it turned into a forgivable loan. Well, I can't tell you how many board leaders told me that for the first time, some attorneys and bankers on their boards woke up and actually said, oh, I've got unique expertise here. I can help you. And the organizations that got PPP money first and fastest were those who had bankers on the board who actually had not really recognized that they had a significant role until that happened. And then they said, oh, I can get you in the door to a bank next Tuesday. as opposed to 5 weeks from next Tuesday. And, I mean, that made a huge difference. So it's not like as with all teams, it's not like we're all about everybody doing everything all the time. It's shared leadership. Let's step in and add the value when we can, but then also have the capacity to step out and have others step in, because that's shared leadership, and that's really appropriate and that's helpful. Now, to your point, in general, just got done with our Essentials of Effective Board Service again last week. So some of you were in that series. I'm sorry, you're going to hear it again. But, there are three broad levels. There's governance, there's management, and then there's the operations. And operations is staff and volunteers. Management is, of course, those in management. And governance is that broad strategic direction setting, policy decisions, things like that. In one sense, people say, oh, well, I guess as a board, we need to come into the weeds. Actually, what's happening is if 25 or 30% of your money is coming from a threatened source, then that makes it a governance issue, because it's a fundamental question. Now, the thing to be careful of, and this is where you as an executive want to be trying to position it and frame it in a way that relates to the work of the board, because the reality is, if you've got a policy oriented board, they're not into management. And by the way, 3/4 of nonprofits in America are not this thing, just to be clear. 2/3 of all nonprofits in America have budgets of less than 100,000 a year. So they're small, and their boards are also their management, and they're also their operations, which, by the way, makes it even messier, because one person's talking operations while somebody else is thinking policy, and they're running by each other while they're having the conversation. So you as an executive director, you as a board chair, that's a critical part of what you can do to try to structure the discussion so that you can focus people at the right level. People often can relate to details in a useful way, that if you just say, we're going to talk about the revenue model for next year, or we're going to talk about changing our revenue model, it's kind of like, well, what the heck does that mean? But, if you simply come in and say, we've got, 25% of our funding threatened next week, and another 50% is in grants that could be hammered later, that might be too tactical. Helping people conceptualize it. And sometimes that means it's beneficial to have a facilitator. Maybe you've got folks on your board or members of your staff who really are good at this. The tough part, of course, is that if you're having a really challenging emotional discussion, having somebody who's in the mess, but also trying to facilitate it, blurs roles in that sense. And you said something, Brent, I do want to go back to with regard to this specifically. A lot of boards haven't really sorted out their roles very clearly anyway, much less when it comes to dialogue about where are we, what's happening, and how do we move forward from here. So working through and just taking time, it seems like a waste to some people, but it's the only way to really be effective. You need to set things up and clarify. For example, there's this continuum of roles from governance to management to operations. We're staying up here at governance, and that's why I'm going to ask you to keep talking about this level of, for example, strategic distinction or a choice we make. And by the way, I'm really depressed about it, but the reality is we are experiencing such disruption in our operating environment of essentially every nonprofit that I'm encountered and working with, that something everybody takes for granted and often never thought about, the foundational elements of mission and core principles or core guiding values. Back up to that stuff and lead from those strategic foundational perspectives and elements to say, you know what, I never thought we'd have to actually talk about this, but it turns out we've got a challenge here, or we see a challenge coming. Ideally, you're actually looking ahead a little bit. And the, couple of people have noted in the chat, thank you, Gene, that, how about with small boards? How about with small organizations? And most organizations are small. So that's one of the reasons why people are confused about when I should be in governance versus when I should be in operations. But the problem with and this is why you want to be careful about using tactics as the sort of framing discussion. If you're caught up in one specific detail, HHS is killing this grant in this week for this period of time, people get so focused on the incidence of that individual challenge that they're forgetting, or not addressing anyway, the higher level. This is actually not one grant crisis. This is an imperative to understand and rethink, or at least assess whether we need to rethink the revenue model and strategic direction. And I imagine, I apologize, Brent, I didn't get to go to your scenario session, but this is an era for, the jargon phrase is emergent strategizing. You've got a strategic plan with 5 or 6 or 8 key streams of strategies. Well, in an environment like this, there are 2 or 3 of those strategies that are so irrelevant to how things are turning out. You got to peel them off, and you're going to add some other strategies that help you cope with these things. And that's where, as you certainly, highlighted in your session, that's why scenario planning and using scenario thinking is relevant. But if people don't know what today is, then it's tough to talk about how it might evolve and where we would change. So without getting sucked into the weeds, trying to help, and obviously it doesn't help to be rude, but say, that's a good point. The higher, when you're facilitating or trying to raise awareness, that's a good point. The higher level version of this is this bigger question, and for the longer period of time. And sometimes it's useful to bring in a third party because they're neutral. And so, especially if you have tensions on the board or tensions between board and executive, people will sometimes hear you telling them, recommending that they move to a higher level of abstraction or something like that, and they'll think, oh, he's just trying to divert us from what we really should be, or what we think we should be talking about. They question your motives for why you're shaping the discussion, and that's unfortunate. If that's a significant issue, then find a neutral. There are many out there, consultants, and sometimes you can have past board members who have that kind of expertise, conflict resolution experience, things like that, to help you organize the discussions.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of discussions to be had, and we have some good questions. The other day, we asked folks for questions coming in, things at top of mind. I do want to put forward the question by Latricia here, because I think it is a important question, but a difficult one, which is how often should founders be involved in board governance? And I think there's no one answer to that, to be honest. And I think maybe a year ago, Dave, you might have had a different answer than what you have today, although I'm not sure. How would you bring a founder in? Should you bring a founder in? And if so, how would you structure that engagement?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say maybe my answer would have been different a year ago than now. I think only in a tactical sense is it different now, because I see so many organizations. I mean, it's partly a function of the era of nonprofit creation in our region and all. We've got lots of founders who are on a transition, or essentially people who are essentially founders. It's kind of like, I was director of the Midwest Center for 30 years, but uh, you know, it existed before I got there, but it had been created. And then Ed Weaver, the founder of the center, actually went to the Kauffman Foundation. So, they went out to hire somebody, couldn't find anybody good, so they hired me. And then we went out and started developing the center. So I wasn't the literal founder of the center, but I am aware that, for better and worse, I am the founder of what it's like right now. And so, thinking about who is the founder, in the sense that what the organization is today and has been fairly recently is the result of the work of the founder or founders, there's often a couple, is really significant. And that's a tension independent of all these other things. That's a tension that a huge share of nonprofits are facing. And it's one of those things that calls for both sensitivity and really sort of clear dialogue. The tough thing is, if the founder pops in, well, that question you asked has two versions. One is, should you bring the founder back in? What I find 2/3 of the time is the founder is already in some way, shape, or form. Now, sometimes they're hiding in the background. You know, the board's meeting in a room and they're in the other room listening, figuratively or even literally, because other people go and report back, hey, Steve, this is what they're doing. What do you think of this? I think creating a specific role for the founder and being clear, but don't just bring them into the conversation. Say, oh, you're the founder. Obviously, you have an interest or relevance. Be clear about what the unique value to be added by that person to the process is, and then involve them at the times where they can offer the greatest value without being disruptive or, I'll speak as another one of those guys who's older than dirt. I I'm back in another era. And make no mistake about it, the founder of the organization was the governance at the beginning, because at the beginning, governance is in the brain of the founder. And then they bring others along who, just like the for profit entrepreneurship world, who comes to be your first board, family, friends, and fools. So, you've got to think about how do we effectively structure. Some organizations haven't made it beyond that founder, and so they're still involved in some way. But working, depending on your role, if you're the executive director or the chair, sitting down with the founder after you've conceived of how they might uniquely help contribute to, but not distract the conversation. The cliche used to be, when you're done, when you're a founder and you're leaving that role, then you should get out. The last decade, we've seen a fair amount of research talking about, does the founder really have to leave? And there are some good things out there. The Nonprofit Quarterly, a couple of other organizations have written about designs, organizational designs that have worked where the founder didn't leave. They created a unique, specific role, and everybody did their best to honor it. And it added value as opposed to being a fight or a distraction. That varies from organization and frankly, person to person. I mean, we're all people, so we show up with certain dynamics, and we aren't necessarily even aware that we're causing those things. A group of zookeepers told me once, the zoo never smells till the people gets there. And, the reality is, you've got all these great designs for governance and board work and all this stuff, and then the people show up and it starts to smell sometimes. Sorry,
That's a great one,
that's why you
David.
paid the big bucks for this session. Oh, wait a
Yeah.
minute, they didn't pay, did they? Oh, never mind. So it's important to think about the role, and try to be creative and constructive. But I will go back to the point I made a few minutes ago, because we need to remember what's the grounding for this. The question is, what's the mission? Not the mission specifically at the time you were started, but how do we engage in our mission given the dynamics of this new environment? And founders may have an interesting way of thinking about it, but it's also possible that they just, you have to help bring them along so that they're in the team and process as opposed to interfering. I wouldn't say try to lock them out, because candidly, what I find that usually does is create hard feelings, and often you'll have somebody, I hate to use this phrase, I used to did some work with grandparents for gun safety, and they got mad at me every time I used a metaphor like this. But, founders will shoot their way into the process if they're not included in some way. So thinking about it, find a way for them to play an active role, help them reinforce the core principles, unless there's a reason you believe that that's actually something we'll have to change.
Yeah. And David, it strikes me that founders, it can be tricky bringing them back to the table. What I would say though is a lot of times founders have a good sense of the values of the organization, and maybe a values level discussion is really important, because when you're in the soup right now, when you're trying to understand, well, what program do we try to keep inching along even though the federal government cut our contract? What ones don't we? I think focusing on values, not inviting the founder in to say, well, you have to keep that program, or no, you can't. I think that is not always a very productive level of discussion right now. But anyways, let's
And could I add one more thing that
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
relates to that? And it's actually what a fair number of organizations have tried to do with founders, but not only founders, and that is to create an advisory council of
Mhm.
some sort that is advisory to the board and create a couple of meetings or a shared meeting or two where you can, the founders and other earlier generation board members who've been really beneficial and are still well connected, bring them into an advisory council. Now, if you create the advisory council and don't ever actually meet with them or any of their people, then it looks like a charade and window dressing and it makes people mad. But if you actually structure some interaction and some engagement, you can put a productive idea generating discussion in that session and then draw the best of those pieces into the actual board work when the board is having discussions with your executives.
That's a great structure to think about. Um, so we have a couple questions that were submitted last week or a couple days ago, I should say, that are around the politics of what's going on. One question is around, hey, I have a board member who's very supportive of the administration, and how do we engage, in productive board discussions when politics enters in? And then likewise, another person said, well, how do we resist, these policies? And so I think it's kind of the opposite end of the conversation. Um, I think we're sort of modeling it here a little bit. We all have opinions about what might be happening in the policy realm. And I think they're all valid, important discussion points. But I think when you're looking at your organization and thinking about how you get from here to there, from here to the next 6 months, from here to the next year, I think everybody should be able to engage at that level regardless of your politics. I know it's hard now. We've all been to Thanksgiving dinners in the past eight years. We all know what those conversations can become. But Dave, any other thoughts about how to sort of work on the political dynamics that could happen in your boardroom?
Yeah, well, to build on, I think amplify what you just said, Brent, my observation is is to be real explicit about that. And it is difficult because there are people who will always perceive it as political, but we have in a sense the benefit of being able to say we are talking about this with regard to impacts on our organization and our mission and what it is we are or are not going to be able to do. um, you know, I will say honestly, again, not to be, political, but I can see the merit to certain things that in principle are supposedly being done at the federal level. It really doesn't make any difference because there are things being done at the federal level. Now, by the way, that's a clue. Don't catastrophize like, oh, look, they said this, whoever they are, and so now it's going to go there like that. Keep it in the context of our organizations. We can keep our work sessions focused on where they literally and in a sense ethically and legally belong, which is with the presenting condition and looking as far out as we can reasonably knowledgeably talk about implications. You can like or dislike what's going on at the federal level with grant freezes and stuff like that. That whether you like it or not has no bearing on what you're called on to do, which is to make sense of how we sustain the core mission and move ahead as an organization, or at least try to stabilize the organization and continue the services we can in our mission. And that's a bigger issue for some folks than it is for others, and it may get to that. But I think the point is you can still and you need to avoid the broad politicization of it by talking about what it is in the context of your organization. Now, there are certain things, we have organizations in town, and I was just reading about an organization yesterday that literally, you know, declined a $250,000 grant because to get it, it's already been awarded, but they were going to have to write out of all their documents all the DEI stuff that, and this was an organization for which that was really an integral part, is an integral part of their work. So they legitimately, again, it wasn't about the politics of the administration. It's about our organization says we're here for this. How central is this? Now, by the way, it's a real powerful conversation. How central is this to our existence? This is core principles and values stuff. Because, are we so committed to what those principles say that we're being told, and again, it's not politicization when someone tells you, and this was the case, and I was reading yesterday, they were literally told your grant will be rescinded if you don't change your mission statement and these principle statements. Okay, that's no longer politics. That's us as an organization deciding where we stand in an environment where the world is shifting. And you go back to the mission and the core constituents and what are we here to be doing? And it's a question of, is this a principle that we're willing to to really go to battle for, or is this in fact incidental enough? And by the way, the politicization can be, oh, we're going to fight about this, but it's kind of like, well, can I live to fight another day? And can we still actually do what we're doing? I heard this at the United Way event last week. Okay, so we'll not cast it in the terms that are irritating the administration and the grant makers, but we're still serving the same group of people in the same ways with the nature of our mission. The workforce, the woman who was from the workforce development group last week was describing how they, we're still in the same game. It's just some of those characteristics that, we've been told, hey, you can't. Now you can dislike that, but that's a hallway conversation. Probably not even good for that. But, keep it on the facts and the constructs that are relevant to today and what's percolating forward, remembering that as a member of the board, as an executive leader, your first focus is to sustain the performance of the mission of the organization. And when the environment shifts around you, that's when the creative, generative kind of stuff has to come into place, because that's when you say, okay, there's a wall there. I guess we're going to have to figure out, if we're still trying to get over there, what do we do about that wall?
Yeah. So in sort of teasing out some of the elements, just we're coming close to time. The key sort of elements I'm hearing, one, and this comes from some of the questions again that folks submitted. There was a theme in the questions, and maybe you all, without having to nod your head, you can agree with this theme, which is some AWOL board members. Board members who haven't been very engaged in the past, and that's an issue. But I think, Dave, to highlight point number one is to sort of say this is a new time for us in how we engage as a group, in between the board and the executive team. We really need you. We really want you. And this is really where we have to sort of make those crucial decisions. Element number, yeah, go
I
ahead.
think that's really critical, Brent. I would like to just amplify what you just said. I get calls, I think you do too, from folks who say, I want to fix this board, or I want to fix that set of members, or something like that. I learned a long time ago, very few people actually want to be fixed. So it kind of reminds me of taking your pet to get neutered or something. I don't know. So anyway, but you don't need to worry about that in a sense. The question is, and it's more relevant now, but it was always relevant. What do we need for our next generation of service? What do we need to enable this organization and the board to add value where it can, the executives where they can, the staff where they can? what's the next generation of service? We don't have to talk about whether you were a good board member or a lackluster board member before. It's irrelevant. The question is, what do we need next generation, and where and how can we engage each of us in the appropriate ways?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you think about sort of content, you also said maybe a good focal element for discussions right now might be around a revenue model and maybe making it real, not esoteric. This is a revenue model, but I think it's funny. Board members tend to either be really good at minute details. Those are the fiduciary people. They love to look at the balance sheet and they love to talk about why'd you spend this much money on copy paper instead of that much money. And then you have other people who are very big picture folks. But I think discussing a revenue model, first of all, is very topical right now because revenue models are being changed in the flick of a Oval Office pen right now, and or Sharpie marker. And therefore, we have to think about where we get our money from, where's our risk. In the resource guide we just posted, Cindy put it in the chat and we'll send it out to you. There's some great resources for you all to sort of talk about risk. Where is that? Where should we be focused right now? Because we have limited time, both with our boards, with our lives. So where do we freak out and have discussions right today? And then where do we say, you know what, this is a discussion that we can have in 6 months or 8 months after we've gotten a sense of the flow of what's happening. Um, so those seems to be really focal. Again, I want to put in a plug for scenario planning, which is something that I'm sure you do intuitively or formally in your organizations, which is to have a plan. Here are the three options of what we have if this thing happens. And the nice thing about scenario planning is to actually have trigger points to sort of tie yourself to the mast to say, if this happens and we hit this thing, then this is the action that will happen. That is really helpful, and your board can really give you that oomph to be able to make those tough decisions and to really hold to those decisions because there's some really tough ones that we're all dealing with right now. And lastly, I think what I'm hearing is to really be intentional about bringing the board back to the table and to think hard about engaging boards for their superpowers, to think intentionally about how to do that. Um, I hate to say it, we are at time, but Dave, I wanted to give you the last say here about how you would move forward in this soupy kind of environment.
Um, I think the sort of key through line for all of this is um, these are very trying and challenging times, although they are trying and challenging to each of our organizations in different ways. But we are also not in this alone. And I think one of the things we have to keep remembering and maybe even give ourselves a little pep talk now and then to get out and give others pep talks. Let's try to rely on the power of partnerships and collaborations. And maybe there are some times when that's even part of the coping strategy. You can't do it alone. Maybe we need to think about, joint ventures or other structures that will actually allow us to thrive through this point in time. The other thing that I would suggest, I implied it earlier on, but there, there's a model, very simplistic model of organizational change developed by a guy named Lewin, and you all know this, whether you know Lewin or not. When we're going through or want to have a transformational change for an organization, you have to unfreeze it, make the shift, and then refreeze. If the forces around you are powerful enough, they will unshift things on you. And I believe we're in one of those times, financially, politically, in multiple ways. So the system is unfreezing. It is evolving. Just the pandemic did this to us, but we're in another similar type of dynamic. It's refreezing. We need to pay attention to sustaining and coping, but that's not enough. While this, while so much is up in the air, are there ways in the name of our mission and principles we can realign things so that as we come out the other side, things are at least partly refrozen in a more constructive way, and we're better prepared to actually honor the needs and issues of our community and our constituents. I think that we have possibilities there, and we, you know, I know when it's hard to remember that you came to drain the swamp when you're up to your ears in alligators, but that's actually part of our superpower, and bring others with you. As you said, bring the board, make it a team, try to find ways to engage folks. Maybe they'll actually find it more engaging because there's real tough stuff to deal with here, but it does affect our impact in our community. And that, the bottom line that we got to remember, we're here to make a difference in the lives of those our mission calls us to serve. So um, we can do it.
That's a great way to end. Thank you, Dave, for that, and please know that we're here to help. Dave is very generous, I know, with his time just to pay for an iced tea, and that keeps him going. But regardless, please reach out. We're very happy to help. Also, I put in one resource from the Nonprofit Financial Commons. Next week, they're having a financial discussion with board session, which they're excellent. I highly recommend. So everybody, please have a wonderful day and do be in touch.